My name is Hannah Pierce, and I'm 26 years old. What I'm about to share happened last autumn during a trip to Tahquamenon Falls State Park in Michigan's Upper Peninsula. I wish I could say it was just a series of bad dreams, but there's no denying what we encountered out there. I've spent countless nights reliving the details, trying to convince myself that it couldn't have been real. Yet the memories are too vivid, the evidence too undeniable. I've come to understand that some things exist outside the realm of comfort, hidden deep within the vast wilderness, waiting for unwary souls like mine. I traveled with 3 friends, Marcus, Carlos, and Taylor. We'd known each other for years, bound by a tradition of annual RV trips to see the best that Michigan has to offer. It started in our college years, weekend getaways to places like the Porcupine Mountains, Grand Haven, or Isle Royale when we could swing it. But this time, we wanted something truly breathtaking. Marcus swore the Upper Peninsula in late autumn was spectacular. He'd visited Tahquamenon Falls once as a kid and had never forgotten the rusty brown hue of the water and the roar of the powerful cascades. As soon as he suggested it, the rest of us agreed. I especially needed the escape. My job had been weighing on me, and my nights were restless. I wanted the hush of pine trees and crisp air to soothe my nerves. We arranged to meet at my place near Lansing and set off early one chilly Thursday morning. The 4 of us loaded into the RV, our mood light and full of excitement for the open road. Marcus drove as usual, blasting classic rock. Taylor, always our navigator, fidgeted with the map app on her phone, calling out the next turn whenever the GPS lost its signal. Carlos, looking to relax and forget the stress of his corporate job, took a seat by the small window, occasionally offering commentary on the local towns we passed. Meanwhile, I settled into the passenger seat, anticipating a calm, rejuvenating trip. The weather, however, seemed determined to challenge us. A cold snap had come in the night before, and our RV's battery was acting up. The heater was also finicky, sometimes blowing hot air for a few minutes before sputtering into lukewarm gusts. Despite these annoyances, we pressed on, convinced we could troubleshoot once we arrived. We lost cell reception a few miles short of the park, which wasn't unusual for the Upper Peninsula, but it did sharpen the sense of isolation. No matter how many times we'd gone off-grid, that moment, when your phone displays no service, always gave me an uneasy thrill. We finally arrived at Tahquamenon Falls State Park in the late afternoon. The sun was already dipping low, casting long shadows through the towering trees. It was colder than I'd anticipated. I could see my breath as I helped Marcus and Carlos set up our campsite in a small clearing. The plan was to stay a few days, photograph the falls, and do some short hikes. There were no other RVs parked near us, just a few scattered tents on the far side of the lot. The quiet was profound, broken only by the faint rush of the river and an occasional breeze rustling dead leaves. We made an early dinner, hot dogs and toasted buns, using the small stove in the RV, and afterward, Taylor suggested we light a campfire to settle into that classic camping ambiance. Despite the dropping temperature, we dragged out folding chairs, gathered around the flames, and tried not to let the biting cold seep into our bones. The conversation was easy at first. Jokes about college memories, teasing Marcus about how he insisted on capturing epic footage for his social media, and speculating about the best trails to explore the next day. But as the night wore on, an unspoken tension lingered. I couldn't tell if it was just the chill or something else. I noticed how Carlos kept glancing behind his chair at the stretch of darkness beyond our campsite, and how Marcus seemed restless, tapping his foot anxiously. Taylor tried to lighten the mood by asking me if I remembered old ghost stories from childhood. I admitted I'd grown up hearing tales of monstrous spirits that haunted northern forests, but I was never sure whether to believe them. We all had a laugh, though it sounded uneasy in the hush of the forest. An hour later, the wind picked up, swirling ashes from the campfire. We decided to call it a night. I crawled onto the fold-out bed in the RV, pulling thick blankets around me, while Carlos and Taylor opted to sleep inside as well. Marcus, adventurous to a fault, insisted he'd be fine in a small tent just outside. He claimed he slept better in the fresh air. I half envied him for wanting that closeness with nature, but also wondered if he was showing off a bit. Sometime around midnight, I awoke to a noise unlike anything I'd heard in a forest before. A moaning cry, too haunting to be a regular animal. It went on for a few seconds, then cut off abruptly. My heart hammered. I listened, but could only hear my own ragged breathing and the faint rustling of leaves. Eventually, exhaustion won out, and I fell back asleep. Morning brought a crisp, pale light and a sense of cautious optimism, despite the memory of that late-night wail. I found Marcus poking at the dying embers of our campfire. He looked tired. I asked him if he'd slept well, and he shrugged. "Something was prowling around the tent last night," he said in a low voice. "Probably a raccoon or fox, but it sounded bigger." I noticed the strain in his eyes, the way he clenched his jaw. Carlos and Taylor joined us, and we busied ourselves with breakfast. Coffee heated on the RV stove, granola bars, and some leftover hot dog buns for good measure. Soon after, we decided to explore the falls. The main attraction was a short hike from our campsite, just under a mile. We loaded up water bottles and cameras, leaving the RV behind. The trail was damp from recent rains, making the leaves slick. On the walk, we occasionally saw footprints from other hikers, but after a while we noticed some odd prints veering off the main path. They seemed elongated, almost human-like, but with an unnerving shape, like a large, narrow foot with deep impressions at the toes. We paused to examine them, the four of us trading uneasy glances. Marcus said it must be someone wearing strange boots, but his voice sounded forced. No one argued. The falls themselves were magnificent, roaring and bronze-tinged from the tannins in the water. For a while, our unease lifted, replaced by awe at nature's power. We took photographs and joked around, getting a little soaked from the mist. Yet I couldn't fully shake the feeling that something was off, as if the forest had eyes that tracked our every step. I told myself it was the residual spookiness from the night before. On our return to the campsite, we passed a scruffy man in a ranger's uniform. He was older, with weathered skin, and a pointed gaze that seemed to size us up in an instant. He asked how we liked the falls. We chatted politely, but something in his demeanor held a note of warning. He told us to be cautious exploring off the marked trails. He'd heard strange reports, local rumors about a creature that lurked in the deeper woods. I forced a laugh, but my stomach tightened. Taylor, curious by nature, asked him if he meant a bear or maybe a wolf. The ranger shook his head, murmuring something about old spirits, then wished us a good day and continued on his way. That afternoon, a storm rolled through, dousing our camp in frigid rain. We crowded inside the RV, tried to get the heater to work properly, and played cards by lantern light. The tension ebbed and flowed, occasionally broken by bursts of laughter when one of us would drop the cards or cheat flamboyantly. But as the rain pounded on the roof, I caught myself listening for that unsettling moan from the night before. The memory refused to let go. When the skies finally cleared around dusk, Marcus announced that he wanted to do a quick recon of a nearby trail to gather some footage before sunset. Carlos was skeptical, grumbling that it was too late and we could resume tomorrow, but Marcus insisted it would take no more than half an hour. Against better judgment, we agreed, though I decided to stay behind, still unsettled by the previous night. Taylor joined me in the RV, while Carlos reluctantly went with Marcus, likely to keep him out of trouble. As soon as they left, a strange quiet enveloped the campsite. It wasn't a peaceful quiet. Rather, it felt charged, as though the forest was holding its breath. Taylor must have sensed it too, because she stopped scrolling on her phone, gave me a small, tense smile, and said, "That ranger, do you think he was messing with us?" I shrugged, not wanting to let my imagination run wild. We both stared out the window, watching the fading light in the trees, waiting for any sign of movement. After nearly an hour, Carlos came running back alone. He threw open the RV door, panting, a wild look in his eyes. "Marcus is fine," he managed to gasp, "but we saw something." I pressed him to explain. He stammered that they'd gone deeper than intended, and at one point they heard a long, low groan echo from the woods. Marcus insisted it had to be the wind through the pines, but then they spotted a tall, gaunt figure moving among the trunks. The figure had eyes that reflected the waning sunlight in a sickly golden glow, and its limbs were disturbingly long. They froze, unsure whether to confront it or run. But in a sudden burst, the creature lurched away, disappearing into the trees. Marcus told Carlos to hurry back to camp. He was filming from behind, capturing the moment on his phone. Within minutes, Marcus returned, practically bursting into the RV. He slammed the door and locked it, his breath clouding up in the cold interior. He tried to show us footage on his phone, but all we saw were shaky shots of the forest floor, a flicker of something pale and tall at the edge of the screen. Whatever it was gone in an instant. Frustration and fear contorted Marcus's face, and he insisted the footage was clearer when he recorded it. Now it was just a blur. Carlos backed him up, swearing they'd both seen the creature vividly. Taylor demanded that we consider leaving right then. We had enough daylight left to navigate back to the main road, she argued. But Marcus bristled, claiming that if we ran now, we'd be missing out on the best part of the trip and letting our fears get the best of us. He tried to rationalize it. Maybe it was just a sick deer rearing up, or a trick of the light. Carlos shot him a look that said he wasn't convinced. I stayed quiet, torn between wanting the safety of a bright motel somewhere far from these woods and not wanting to spoil everyone's trip because of an odd sighting. In the end, we stayed. Sometimes I wish I had insisted on leaving. That night, the wind had a sharp, keening note, whistling through the pines, rattling the dead branches. We built a large campfire, huddling around it as though it were a life raft in a sea of shadows. No one felt comfortable sleeping in a tent, so we arranged the RV's seats and beds to fit all four of us, though it was cramped. Marcus kept casting the flashlight around, checking for movement beyond the glow of the fire. Every time the wind gusted, we jumped at the rustle of leaves. At some point, I smelled something foul, like decaying flesh. The odor was faint but unmistakable, wafting on the shifting breeze. I whispered to Taylor, and she said she caught a whiff too. Then came the shriek. It sounded distant, but cut through the air like a razor. We bolted upright, hearts hammering. Marcus scrambled for the bear spray we'd brought, though I doubted it would be much use against whatever had made that sound. Carlos reached over to stoke the fire higher. In the flickering light, we saw a flash of movement near the tree line, a silhouette, tall and impossibly thin, the edges of its form rippling as if it were vibrating with hunger. Eyes glinted. My pulse pounded. The creature stood there, regarding us. Even at a distance, its presence radiated malevolence, a predatory interest in our huddle around the flames. Then it stepped back into the darkness and vanished. We didn't sleep that night. We tried to keep the fire going, but the wood supply was limited. Around 3 a.m, we heard scraping at the RV door, a slow, deliberate scratch like claws testing the metal. We all froze, hearts in our throats. Marcus silently indicated for us to switch off the lantern inside, so we doused it, leaving only the faint glow of dying embers outside. For a minute or two, we heard more scratching, and then a soft, guttural moan. Taylor was trembling, eyes wide, one hand clamped over her mouth to keep from screaming. I pressed my ear to the RV wall, barely breathing, dreading what might happen if the door gave way. At dawn, we finally mustered the courage to look outside. The first rays of light revealed fresh tracks around our RV, elongated footprints with deep impressions at the toes, almost as if something had human-like feet but far larger, far more warped. Marcus pointed to scratches along the lower side of the RV door. They looked like claw marks. We found a small pile of torn fur near the edge of the clearing, possibly from some small animal, half-eaten. There was no way to pretend this was normal wildlife behavior. Fear weighed on each of us. The logical decision was to leave immediately. Carlos and Taylor started packing up, while I helped Marcus check the engine. But of course the battery was acting up again, refusing to start on the first few tries. Each grinding failure of the ignition shot adrenaline through my veins, as if the forest might close in at any second. Finally, after a tense 15 minutes, the engine roared to life. Relief coursed through me, and we scrambled to secure the RV for departure. Marcus glanced at his phone. It had a sliver of battery left, but no signal. He shook his head in frustration, muttering how he wished he could show someone the footage. I felt some pity for him, but I also wanted nothing more than to drive and never look back. We took off down the narrow road that led out of the park, bouncing over potholes, scanning the tree line for any sign of that monstrosity. A few miles in, the RV lurched. A warning light flared on the dashboard. We pulled over near a stand of pine trees. Carlos hopped out to check the tires. One was dangerously low, likely punctured by a sharp rock. Panic surged. We were stuck in the heart of the forest, in a place that might still be under that creature's watchful eye. The men hurried to change the tire while Taylor and I stood guard, bear spray and a hatchet we'd used to chop kindling in hand. The forest was unnervingly still. No birds sang, no squirrels chattered. The silence itself felt hostile, like an intruder was just out of sight, waiting. We managed to fix the tire, though our nerves were shot. Once we got back on the road, there was a unanimous agreement. We would head straight home, or at least find a motel near a more populated town. Our plan hit a snag when we found the next intersection blocked by a fallen tree. The storm the previous day must have done more damage than we realized. We'd have to backtrack or take a detour on a rougher, less traveled route. Marcus, consulting the tattered map, told us about a Forest Service road that should connect back to the main highway eventually. Though it was a gamble, we couldn't just sit and wait. So we took the service road, hoping it wouldn't lead us deeper into trouble. The path was narrow, thick with gravel and debris, and the trees towered over us, forming a corridor of looming trunks and spindly branches. Every so often, we'd see movement in the corner of our eyes, shadows slipping behind the trees. Carlos kept his foot on the gas, but the RV could only go so fast on that terrain. The further we went, the more I felt like we were entering the heart of something ancient and malevolent, as though the forest recognized us as outsiders, ripe for the hunt. Then, in the middle of a bend, the engine sputtered. The RV coughed and died. We coasted to a halt on the rocky path. Carlos cursed, popping the hood. We all climbed out, fear coiling around us. Marcus went pale, whispering that he felt like we were being watched. Taylor clutched my arm, her fingers trembling. Carlos rummaged under the hood, trying to identify the problem. A loose connection? A damaged hose? The battery, though replaced, might be failing again. The minutes dragged on, and the dread multiplied with every second we stayed in that vulnerable position. We heard branches snapping off to our left. Marcus grabbed the bear spray and I lifted the hatchet. Taylor tried to steady her breathing, tears brimming in her eyes. Another crack, closer this time. Carlos slammed the hood shut. "I think I fixed it," he whispered urgently. "Get in." Just as we scrambled back inside, the figure emerged between the pines. A skeletal shape with protruding ribs and a hunched back, its skin a patchy gray. The head was elongated, almost deer-like, but twisted, with eyes that burned bright against the gloom. It let out a shriek that stabbed into my eardrums, high and furious, and charged toward us, closing the distance unnaturally fast. Carlos scrambled to start the RV, and the engine coughed into life just as the creature slammed a clawed hand against the rear window, cracking the glass. We lurched forward. I glimpsed its face, half rotten, half beast, twisted in permanent hunger. We sped down the service road, bouncing wildly over the uneven ground. I risked a glance out the back window. The creature was chasing us, loping on all fours with nightmarish speed, its bony arms and legs contorting in impossible angles. Somehow, we gained distance, but the panic in the RV was deafening, with Taylor crying and Marcus barking directions to Carlos about how to handle the terrain. My heart hammered so violently, I wondered if I'd pass out. After several minutes that felt like hours, the service road forked. Carlos picked the path that seemed more worn. We careened around a tight corner, and the next stretch was mercifully downhill. We coasted faster, scraping branches on both sides. Then, all at once, we burst out onto a paved road. Blessed civilization in the form of rough asphalt. I looked behind us. The creature was gone. Whether it had abandoned the chase or simply decided to retreat into the forest, I had no idea. But we didn't wait to find out. We kept driving until we saw a sign for a small roadside motel, the kind with a neon vacancy sign flickering in the gray morning light. We pulled in, parked behind the building, and practically fell out of the RV, trembling and exhausted. The manager gave us odd looks when we stumbled inside, reeking of sweat, fear, and the musty forest. We booked 2 rooms without caring about the cost. Once behind the locked motel door, we collapsed onto the beds in stunned silence. Marcus, of all people, looked the most shaken. The once fearless adventurer had tears in his eyes, though he tried to hide them. "I never believed in that stuff," he muttered. "Legends, wendigos, forest spirits, all that. I thought it was just lore. But we saw it." Carlos nodded grimly, lost in thought. Taylor was still trembling, arms wrapped around her knees, staring at the worn carpet. As for me, I couldn't stop seeing its eyes every time I blinked, glowing with that ravenous intensity, as if it had singled us out for a hunt. We stayed one night at the motel, leaving the next morning with reluctant relief. The manager asked if we'd been near the falls, and we just nodded, giving no details. I think none of us wanted to risk sounding insane. Once we got on the highway, the rest of the drive was a blur. We hardly spoke. The miles rolled past as we moved farther from that haunted wilderness, uncertain if we'd truly escaped its reach. When we finally reached home, we went our separate ways. We exchanged a few messages in the following days, but no one was eager to talk in depth about the incident. Each night I'd wake in a sweat, hearing phantom shrieks echo through my nightmares. I tried to find a rational explanation. Maybe it was a deformed bear or a crazed hermit. But my mind kept returning to those legends I'd heard growing up, about monstrous spirits dwelling in the deep north woods, feasting on fear and flesh. Wendigo. The name alone made my blood run cold. Marcus eventually posted a cryptic video on social media showing a shaky shot of the forest, accompanied by a half-coherent story about something weird in the Upper Peninsula. He got a few mocking comments and jokes, but he didn't care. He soon took it down, probably after reading the dismissive remarks. Taylor tried to talk to a friend who was studying anthropology about the local myths, but she quickly dropped the conversation when he looked at her with pitying skepticism. Carlos, the most pragmatic of us, told me he was searching for any official accounts of sightings in that area. I don't know if he found anything that matched our description. Months passed, and the nightmares lessened. Life resumed its normal patterns: work, errands, weekend outings that didn't involve straying too far from civilization. But an unspoken weight settled on all of us. We tried to meet up for dinner a few times, but the dynamic had changed. The tension was raw, an unspoken bond of trauma. None of us seemed eager to plan another trip, even a simple day hike in a local park. It felt like the wilderness had betrayed us, or maybe we had intruded on something that was never meant for our eyes. I keep thinking about how the forest seemed so alive and hostile that night, how the wind carried an unnatural moan, and how those footprints materialized around our RV. I think about the ranger who warned us, and how I wish I had taken his advice seriously. He knew, or at least suspected, that there were old forces at work in those woods, and we had barged in like naive explorers. My nightmares still show me glimpses of that skeletal figure crouched at the edge of the tree line, eyes glowing, breath steaming in the cold night air. Sometimes I see it chasing me, the ground shifting to quicksand beneath my feet. Other times, I see it clawing at the RV door, forcing its way in, and I wake with a scream lodged in my throat. I haven't mustered the courage to return to Taquamenon Falls. Even the thought of those majestic waters now sends an icy trickle of fear down my spine. I don't know if what we saw is still out there, hungry and waiting for the next group of unsuspecting campers. Perhaps it roams a wide territory, an ancient spirit bound to the deep forests of the Upper Peninsula, slipping between the trees in that silent, predatory way. Part of me hopes that it's satisfied with whatever it found in the wilderness, that it won't need to stalk humans again. But another part of me fears it's only a matter of time before someone else stumbles into that same terror. The official story we told friends and co-workers was that our equipment malfunctioned, the weather was too severe, and we decided to cut the trip short. We never said anything about the creature or those horrific nights. When people ask if I recommend visiting Tahquamenon Falls, I just smile thinly and say yes, but bring extra blankets and keep an eye on the time. And when they ask if the place is haunted by anything, I lie, because I can't bring myself to share the truth. I can't stand the judgmental stares or the possibility that they might shrug it off, venture out there without caution, and suffer a fate that we narrowly escaped. Sometimes, on quiet evenings, I check the news for any strange reports. Missing hikers, bizarre animal mutilations, unexplained footprints. If something appears, my stomach knots, and I wonder if it's the creature's handiwork. But so far, I haven't found anything conclusive. There are rumors, of course, local whispers about wendigos in the North Woods, sightings of gaunt figures with glowing eyes. Yet none of it has turned up in an official capacity. Perhaps that's for the best. Could the public handle knowing that monsters walk among the pines? When I recount the story in my head, everything feels so immediate and visceral. The smell of pine needles, the icy bite of the wind, the terror of that thing scraping at our door. Sometimes I question my own memory. But then I recall the look in my friend's eyes, the battered RV door, the horrific tracks in the mud. The evidence was real, though it's all intangible now. Just nightmares and a few damaged bits of metal. Still, I can't forget the haunting certainty in the ranger's gaze, or the unearthly shriek echoing through the pines, or the emaciated silhouette stepping into our firelight. They say that nature can be cruel, but that cruelty is usually explained by storms, predators, or the indifferent harshness of survival. This was something else. Something older than the forests themselves. A force of hunger and dread that defies rational logic. I wonder if that knowledge will ever leave me, if the memory will fade into some half-forgotten ghost story. But I doubt it. Fear like that becomes part of you, seeping into the cracks of your mind. It lingers behind every rustle in the night, every unknown shape in the corner of your vision. I remind myself that we survived. We escaped. Some are not so lucky, if legends are to be believed. Marcus still can't sleep without a bright nightlight. Carlos obsesses over mechanical checks every time he drives, and Taylor told me she's begun therapy for panic attacks. As for me, my eyes snap open at the smallest creak in the dark. Every once in a while, I'll glance at my phone late at night, half expecting to see footage of that gaunt figure, its mouth parted in an endless hunger, flickering across the screen. I've come to see the forest differently, not just as a serene haven, but as a vast, unknowable domain that can cradle terrors older than our civilization. Maybe the Upper Peninsula is still that wilderness of legends, with corners untamed by modern logic. We ventured into it, looking for adventure and photographs, but we found something else entirely. A reminder that some stories aren't just stories. Every time the wind howls, or I catch a strange silhouette against the moonlit sky, I feel that old fear waking up inside me. There are places on this earth that aren't meant for people like us, places where something else holds dominion. And if you wander too far, if you ignore the warnings, or if you're just unlucky, you might discover the truth. You might come face to face with something that shouldn't exist, yet does, lurking between the pines. That's my story. My name is Hannah Pierce, and I'm 26 years old. This all happened last autumn in Tahquamenon Falls State Park. I doubt I'll ever go back. And if you do, I can only hope you'll heed the warnings and keep to the well-worn paths. Because in those dark woods, something hungry still waits. And once it has your scent, there's no telling how close it'll get before you realize it's already upon you. My name is Simone Reyes, and I am 34 years old. This happened in early spring of this year, when I decided to take my RV along the White Pine Trail in Michigan for some much-needed solitude and a chance to photograph the awakening wilderness. I had recently quit my corporate job, a decision that left me feeling unmoored, and I thought that escaping the city to live on the road, if only for a few weeks, would help me find clarity. Sometimes, it takes a brush with the unknown to realize that clarity and peace are not always found where we expect. This is the story of how I discovered that certain tragedies don't always stay in the past, and that sometimes restless spirits do indeed walk among us. I remember that first day vividly. The sky was a washed-out gray, and the wind still carried the bite of winter. My RV, an old but beloved vehicle I had named Pollux, rattled along a winding back road leading toward the White Pine Trail State Park. The drive took longer than I expected. My route had me detouring around patches of snow still clinging to the shoulders of the highways, but I felt strangely excited. I had read that the White Pine Trail was stunning in summer and fall, but in early spring, the park would likely be all but empty. The idea of having so much space to myself was simultaneously thrilling and a little unnerving. After hours of driving, I pulled into a small gravel lot near the trailhead, just outside the town of Cadillac. The wind whipped my hair across my face as I climbed down from the RV to stretch my legs. The open sky above the trail beckoned me forward, promising fresh air, quiet, and the chance to settle my restless mind. Without much ado, I set up a makeshift camp. Leveling the RV, hooking up the limited amenities offered, and verifying that my water and battery levels were adequate, I planned to sleep here for at least one night before deciding whether to continue traveling north or stay longer. Even in those first moments, something felt a bit off about the place. It was subtle, a faint hush that went beyond the expected stillness of a largely vacant trail. Still, I shrugged it off. I was determined not to let my overactive imagination get the better of me. After all, I had come here to embrace solitude. If my senses were heightened, maybe it was just excitement. That evening, I decided to walk into town for supplies. About a mile away, on the edge of a dusty side road, stood a diner that looked straight out of the 1950s, a neon sign flickering overhead, checkered tile floors inside, and the aroma of fried food greeting me at the door. The place was nearly empty, except for an older woman behind the counter and a tired-looking man hunched over a cup of coffee. The woman, her name tag read Jackie, welcomed me with a warm, if somewhat cautious smile. I ordered a grilled cheese and a hot cup of coffee, grateful to feel the heat spreading through my cold hands. Jackie asked if I was passing through, and I explained I was camping along the White Pine Trail. She pursed her lips and nodded. "Beautiful place," she said, her voice low, "but quiet this time of year. You be careful, especially in the evenings. Don't wander too far off that path. Some folks say they see things, kids mostly in the woods." I raised an eyebrow, uncertain if she was joking or genuinely trying to warn me. She offered a sad half smile. "Just some local talk. You know how it is in these small towns. Stories get passed down." I tried to press her for details, but she shrugged me off, only adding, "I'd stick to the main trail if I were you." The man in the booth, presumably a regular, grunted in agreement. Part of me was intrigued by her mention of children in the woods, but I had no desire to pry. Still, the way her expression shifted made me think there was more to the story. I returned to my RV that night under a moonless sky, starlight faint and distant overhead. I had left a small lantern glowing by the RV's window, and its warm yellow glow was a welcome sight in the otherwise inky darkness. Inside, the space felt cramped, but comforting. A bed at the back, a small kitchen nook, and the driver's area up front, enough for one person to live in relative comfort for a short while. I popped open my laptop, hoping to review a few photos I'd taken, but found it difficult to concentrate. Jackie's words echoed in my head, and I caught myself staring out the window several times, listening. There was only silence, aside from the occasional groan of wind rustling the skeletal branches outside. That was when I first heard it. Soft giggles, as though children were running around outside playing a game of tag. I froze, the hair on the back of my neck prickling. There shouldn't be any kids near the trail at this hour. My heart kicked into overdrive. Maybe it was the wind, swirling through the branches in a way that mimicked laughter. Another giggle, clearer this time, drifted from behind the RV. Adrenaline pumped, and I crept to the small window. Peering out, I saw nothing but dark shapes of trees. The sound had ceased. I flicked off my lantern in case the light was preventing me from seeing into the darkness. But nothing moved out there. No children, no footsteps. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Eventually, I told myself I was imagining it all. The stress of leaving my job and the loneliness of traveling alone were probably messing with my head. I crawled under my blankets, forcing my eyes shut. Yet the rest of the night I slept in fitful starts, jolting awake at the slightest rustle outside. Morning couldn't come fast enough. When dawn finally broke, it brought gray clouds and a damp chill that settled into my bones. I made myself coffee on the tiny stove and stepped outside to breathe in fresh air, hoping to dispel the lingering unease. My eyes drifted to the dirt around the RV, where I noticed small footprints in the mud. They were definitely footprints, not shoe prints. They looked like little human feet, maybe those of a 7 or 8-year-old, with toes spread out in the squishy earth. A tremor ran through me. Nobody else had been here. Even if some child was camping nearby, I would have seen or heard more. And these footprints circled the RV in a strange pattern, as though whoever made them had walked around and around in the dark. That's when another vehicle pulled in, an official-looking pickup with a green and gray logo on the side. A park ranger climbed out, Officer Donovan. He appeared to be in his 50s, with tired eyes and a deliberately calm demeanor. He greeted me politely, then asked if I was planning to hike the White Pine Trail. I nodded and told him I was hoping to do some photography. He gave me the standard warnings about early spring conditions. Watch for ice on bridges, mind the muddy sections, keep an eye out for flooding in the streams. I felt compelled to ask him about the footprints and the giggling I'd heard the night before. He went silent for a beat, then shrugged. People around here talk about the ghosts of some kids who drowned in a creek a couple miles down the trail, back in the 1970s. It was a freak accident during the spring thaw. The ground collapsed, water rushed under the ice, and they were gone. Happens more than it should. His tone was professional, but I caught an undercurrent of unease. I can't say I believe in that kind of stuff, he continued, but folks do report hearing weird things. If you're not comfortable staying out here, best to camp closer to town. My pride wouldn't let me admit how unsettled I was. I told him I'd be careful, and he drove off, leaving me with the muddy footprints and a knot in my stomach. Despite the disquiet, a stubborn part of me refused to run. I had come here to face my own demons, my uncertainty about my life, my guilt for leaving a stable career behind, and I wasn't about to let local legends scare me away. In hindsight, maybe that was foolish, but at the time, I needed to prove something to myself. I spent the day hiking north along the White Pine Trail, snapping pictures of budding trees and early wildflowers. From time to time, I veered onto short side trails, each leading to scenic overlooks or small streams. The land was quiet in that transitional season, neither fully winter nor truly spring. Patches of snow lingered in shady spots, while moss and new grass attempted to push through. Hours passed. The haunting events of the night before began to recede, replaced by the meditative rhythm of my footsteps. In the mid-afternoon, I spotted a small, bright orange tent pitched in a clearing off the main path. Smoke rose from a tiny fire pit. A woman waved to me. Her name was Dana, she said, a fellow camper who preferred traveling by motorbike. It was nice to see another human out there. We chatted briefly, trading the usual traveler small talk. She invited me to join her for a quick cup of tea, but I politely declined, wanting to get back before dusk. Something about the emptiness of the forest at night made me uneasy, and I preferred the relative safety of my RV. We parted ways, exchanging stories of near misses on slippery trails. As I returned, I felt a strange mixture of relief and guilt. Relief that I wasn't the only soul camping out here. Guilt that I was too cowardly to enjoy even a brief social moment in the woods. But the further I walked, the more I convinced myself that a quiet evening in my RV might actually be good for me. I wanted to reflect, maybe journal about the direction I wanted my life to take. When I reached my campsite, the sun was low, painting the sky with streaks of pink and gold. My RV was just as I'd left it, though I couldn't shake the sense that someone had been near it again. The dirt around the tires was newly disturbed, the footprints smudged. Trying to ignore the spike of anxiety, I cooked a quick meal of canned soup on my stove, ate in silence, and tried to read a paperback novel. The daylight faded, and soon I was enveloped in darkness once more. Sometime after 9, as I was prepping to call it a night, the lights inside my RV flickered. At first, I thought it was a power surge or a loose connection. Then, the overhead lamp cut out entirely. I scrambled to the breaker box but found nothing amiss. After a few seconds, the lights blinked back on. I shook my head, convinced it was just the old wiring acting up. But right then, the radio by my kitchen nook clicked on. Static hissed through the speakers. My hand hovered over the switch, ready to shut it off, but something stopped me. The faint sound of a child's voice threading through the static, singing a tuneless lullaby that sent chills down my spine. My breathing quickened, and I shut off the radio, adrenaline surging through my veins. A wave of dread washed over me. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe an odd frequency or interference had caused that eerie snatch of melody, but my instincts were screaming that it was something else. Desperate to reassure myself, I grabbed a flashlight, stepped outside, and walked a circle around the RV. The hair on my arms stood on end. The air felt charged, as if a thunderstorm was approaching. Yet the sky was clear, stars blinking faintly above. Then behind me, a giggle. I spun, nearly dropping the flashlight. The beam landed on nothing but a patch of scraggly shrubs. Another giggle, this time from my left, like multiple children flitting around me. My mouth felt dry as I swept the light across the darkness. A flicker of movement caught my eye, a small form darting behind a tree. My heart hammered so loudly I could hear my pulse in my ears. I took a few shaky steps forward, shining the flashlight at the base of the tree. A child's face peeked out, ashen skin, eyes wide, mouth parted in a silent grin. She wore what looked like a threadbare coat, old-fashioned in style, the hem tattered and muddy. For a second, our eyes locked. In them, I saw something like sorrow and fear, but also curiosity. Then the girl darted away, vanishing into the deeper gloom. I stumbled back into the RV, slammed the door, and double-locked it, my chest constricting. I had just seen a ghost, or I was losing my mind. Maybe exhaustion and isolation had me hallucinating. Yet the moment felt too real to dismiss. Inside, the lights flickered again, as if some unseen presence wanted my attention. For hours, I sat huddled on my bed, knees tucked to my chest, scanning every shadow. The lights stayed on, but I was too terrified to sleep until exhaustion eventually claimed me. In the morning, the sky was overcast, threatening rain. I forced myself to step out and check the area. Sure enough, more small footprints marked the mud near the RV. This time, a set of 2 or maybe 3 distinct prints, as though multiple children had indeed circled my campsite in the night. My mind replayed the diner owner's cryptic warning and Officer Donovan's story about drowned children. It was no coincidence. Something was stirring in these woods, and it wanted me to see it. My plan was to leave. I couldn't handle another night of that haunting. I fired up Pollux's engine, mentally apologizing for my earlier bravado about not being scared. The engine roared to life for a few seconds, then sputtered and died. I tried again. Nothing. A third time, it clicked weakly before going silent. Cursing under my breath, I popped the hood. I'm no mechanic, but I could tell the battery wasn't charging properly. Maybe some belt was loose, or the alternator was going. Either way, I was stuck until I could arrange a tow truck or get to an auto parts store. But my phone had no service here, and the idea of walking miles to town, leaving the RV behind, felt terrifying. I decided to hike toward the diner, hoping I could use their phone or find a local who'd help me jump the battery. On my way, I checked the clearing where I had met Dana, only to discover her tent was gone, her fire pit cold. I felt a pang of disappointment. Some small part of me had hoped for company, or at least an explanation. As I continued, I heard a commotion near a bend in the trail. Officer Donovan stood there talking to a frantic Dana. Her face was pale as she gestured toward the trees, voice trembling. When she saw me, she rushed over, blurting about hearing screams and seeing childlike figures at the edge of her camp the night before. She'd packed up at first light, planning to leave ASAP. Hearing her story validated my own experiences. We exchanged phone numbers, but neither of us had reception. She was heading in the opposite direction, hoping to find an open road. I considered joining her, but something made me hesitate. If these ghostly children were real, if they were stuck here in some loop of suffering, then running away felt wrong. Don't ask me why I felt compelled to help. I barely understood it myself. But the memory of the little girl's face kept surfacing, that mix of fear and longing in her wide eyes. I turned to Officer Donovan, who wore a pinched expression. "You could come with me," he offered. "I can drive you back to town, arrange a mechanic." I almost agreed, but then told him I wanted to see the creek where the drowning supposedly happened. Maybe it was pure curiosity, or maybe some moral imperative had taken root in me. He tried to dissuade me at first, but eventually agreed to lead me there. The creek was a short hike off the main trail, at the bottom of a ravine. The sight was eerie. An old rope swing still hung from a decaying branch, swaying slightly in the breeze, as though it were waiting for children who would never return. Officer Donovan explained that a group of kids had come here decades ago, playing on the ice. The ice broke unexpectedly, and 2 of them were swept under by the current. Their bodies were found days later, far downstream. A tragedy that had shaken the community at the time. I felt a cold sorrow gnawing at my chest as I gazed at the trickle of water, half iced over, even now. Why were these spirits still here, haunting random campers? Could it be they were lost, confused, looking for help? As if in answer, a swirl of mist rose from the creek, and I heard a soft voice whisper, "Help us," so faint it might have been imagined. Officer Donovan caught my eye, worry etched in his features. "We should go," he said, voice tight. "This place isn't safe." I nodded, and we made our way back up the ravine. He offered me a ride to the diner so we could call a tow truck. My heart hammered with indecision. Finally, I told him yes, but first I had to pick up a few valuables from my RV. We parted ways. He would grab his truck from a nearby ranger station, and I'd meet him on the main road. When I reached my RV, I found the door slightly ajar. Inside, the overhead lights were flickering again, and the radio crackled. I mustered my courage and stepped in. My belongings were in disarray. A few items had fallen off shelves. Curtains lay rumpled on the floor, as though yanked down. I felt a sudden presence behind me. I spun around to see a boy, maybe 8 years old, with pale, damp hair clinging to his forehead. He wore knee-length shorts and a threadbare sweater that dripped water onto my floor. His eyes locked on mine, wide and pleading. He opened his mouth as if to speak, but no sound emerged, just a trembling hush. Another shape appeared behind him, the girl from last night. Her face was drawn, her lips bluish. My heart thundered in my chest, torn between terror and empathy. I found my voice, stammering something about wanting to help them. Their eyes flicked to the door, as though beckoning me to follow. Then, as quickly as they appeared, they vanished, leaving behind damp footprints on my RV floor. It was insane, but part of me wondered if they needed some kind of closure about the creek, a memorial, anything to release them from this earthly tether. I grabbed a small bouquet of faux flowers I kept near the bed, originally for decoration, and a pack of tea light candles. My mind raced with the half-formed plan to go back to the creek, say a prayer, leave these items as an offering. Maybe that would put their spirits to rest. Outside, the sky darkened prematurely, heavy clouds rolling in. Rain threatened. I clutched the flowers and candles, heading toward the path that led to the creek. As I descended the ravine, the wind picked up, hurling leaves and debris around me. The rope swing creaked ominously. Near the water's edge, I set the flowers in a small clearing, arranged the candles in a circle, and flicked a lighter. The wind made it nearly impossible to keep the flame, so I cupped my hands around it, eventually lighting the tiny wicks. The drizzle began, cold droplets pricking my skin. I bowed my head, unsure how to speak to ghosts. I tried anyway. I told them I was sorry for what happened, that they deserved peace, that I hoped this small gesture would let them move on. My voice trembled. The wind howled, sending a shiver down my spine. For a moment, I thought nothing would happen. Then behind me, I heard the faint sound of children crying. I turned, and there they were, the boy and girl, silhouettes partially transparent in the fading light. They edged closer, peering at the candlelit memorial. Tears glistened in their eyes. A wave of emotion crashed over me. I whispered that it was okay, that they could rest. The girl stepped forward, raising a trembling hand as though she wanted to touch the flowers. Lightning flashed overhead, illuminating her spectral form in stark detail. For a second I saw the gash on her forehead, the soaked clothes clinging to her frail body, the bruises on her arms, remnants of a terrible final struggle. Then thunder boomed, and the candle flames snuffed out. Darkness swallowed the ravine. My heart pounded so fiercely I thought it would burst. Another flash of lightning revealed the children still there, standing by the water, gazing at me. Then, in one fluid motion, they turned and walked into the creek, fading until only the swirling current remained. Tears blurred my vision, and I gasped, stumbling back. Something inside me felt lighter, as if I'd released a burden I didn't know I was carrying. I climbed up the ravine in the downpour, half slipping on muddy ground, adrenaline surging through me, my clothes stuck to my skin. When I reached level ground, I spotted headlights, Officer Donovan, waiting in his truck. He lowered the window and shouted over the rain, asking if I was okay. I staggered to the passenger door and all but collapsed inside, dripping water onto the seat. My breath came in ragged bursts. He stared at me with concern, but something in his eyes told me he knew. Maybe he'd never fully believed the stories, but he'd seen enough evidence tonight to reconsider. We drove to the diner in silence. The neon sign flickered in the rain, casting ghostly reflections on the puddles in the gravel lot. Inside, Jackie rushed over with a towel, her eyes darting between me and the ranger. She guided me to a back booth, urging me to warm up. Officer Donovan used the phone to call a tow truck for my RV, but they told him they wouldn't be able to get to it until morning. As I sipped hot coffee, I realized how utterly exhausted I felt, yet also a strange sense of peace. Jackie asked me if I'd seen anything unusual out there, and I simply said, "I think they're at rest now." She stared at me for a moment, comprehension dawning in her gaze, then nodded and pressed my hand gently. She never asked for details, and I never offered any. I spent that night in the diner's spare back room. Apparently Jackie had a small cot for emergencies. The next morning, I was up at dawn, stiff and sore, but eager to check on my RV. The tow truck driver was already at the lot when we arrived, tinkering under the hood. Within half an hour, he had the engine purring again, attributing the failure to a corroded connection. Officer Donovan lingered a few yards away, arms crossed, as though he was curious about my next move. I thanked him for his help and told him I planned to be on my way. He nodded in understanding. We shared a brief look, a silent recognition that what happened in those woods defied easy explanations. I drove off, the tires crunching over wet gravel, heading down the long road that led away from the White Pine Trail. The air smelled fresh, cleansed by the storm. My thoughts wandered to the children, to the heartbreak of their unfinished lives. I hoped, in some small way, that the memorial by the creek, the flowers and candles, had given them peace. Maybe it was just an act of compassion from a living soul, but maybe that was enough. The solitude of the trail forced me to confront not just my fear of the unknown, but my own regrets and doubts as well. There are still nights when I close my eyes and see the girl peering at me from behind a tree, her eyes filled with silent pleas. But now, I also see her walking away into the water, her spirit finally free. In a strange twist, the experience taught me that some spirits aren't meant to be banished by fear or denial. They need understanding, empathy, maybe even a gentle goodbye. I continue my travels in Pollux, though I seldom linger in one place for long. Once in a while, I hear a bit of local folklore about ghosts or lost souls, and I feel a pull to investigate. Not because I'm fearless, I'm anything but because I've come to realize that the dead, when they wander, might simply need someone to guide them home. People sometimes ask why I left my old career, suspecting I had a midlife crisis or ran out of ambition. Maybe that was part of it. But there is another reason, one I rarely share. The world is wide, filled with stories both living and departed, and for now, I feel called to witness them. After all, there's a fragile beauty in bridging the gap between what we understand and what we fear. Looking back on those damp footprints around my RV, the child's giggle echoing through the static on my radio, the heartbreak etched into the faces of those ghostly children. I see it all as a reminder that trauma lingers in the earth, that sadness doesn't simply fade when flesh fails. And maybe we, the living, have a role to play in easing that sorrow. I hope that in doing so, I also find my own peace. For a moment on the White Pine Trail, I stood at the intersection of two worlds, and I realized that real compassion doesn't always involve the living alone. Sometimes it involves extending a hand across the veil. So yes, this happened. And though the details may seem beyond logic, they remain engraved in my memory as vividly as that first glimpse of the creek. I still remember the rustle of dead leaves in the wind, the hollow ring of thunder in the ravine, the flicker of lightning illuminating the silhouettes of two lost children. I remember the weight I felt lifting from my chest when they faded into the swirling current. And most of all, I remember how I felt the next morning, when I breathed in the crisp air and realized that maybe, just maybe, we'd all found a kind of release.